Look at your hands right now. Keep them still. Within the next 4 seconds, your brain is going to register a subtle micro-adjustment in your posture, a change in your breathing rate, or a slight shift in how tight your shoulders are. You might not notice it consciously, but your nervous system is constantly reading the environment for threats. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you grew up or lived in an environment where your boundaries were repeatedly breached, where you had to walk on eggshells, fix other people's emotional messes, or swallow your anger just to keep the peace, your brain created a corrupted baseline. What most people call patience or being understanding is actually a fear response. It's a behavioral reflex called fawning. You've trained yourself to tolerate chaos, disrespect, passive aggression, and emotional manipulation because, to your unhealed nervous system, familiar discomfort feels safer than the unfamiliar conflict of setting a boundary. Think about that for a second. When you are unhealed, your threshold for tolerance is absurdly high. You accept breadcrumbs of affection. You let people interrupt you, dismiss your boundaries, minimize your feelings, and drain your cognitive bandwidth. You convince yourself that you're just being the bigger person. But you're not being the bigger person. You're being an easy target. Manipulative individuals, narcissists, and covert controllers have an uncanny ability to spot this exact trait in seconds. They read your submissive nonverbal signals, the subtle head tilts, the quick nervous laughter after a backhanded compliment, the over-explaining, and they know your door is wide open. Now picture what happens when you start to fix that wire in your brain. When you heal, when you systematically regulate your nervous system and develop genuine emotional self-awareness, something radical shifts. Your tolerance doesn't slowly decline, it collapses. The things you used to let slide for months or years suddenly make you physically uncomfortable in seconds. The backhanded comments? You call them out or walk away immediately. The toxic partner or demanding boss. The charm doesn't work on you anymore because you are no longer operating from a deficit of validation. This speech isn't just a list of feel-good psychological theories. This is an operational breakdown of human behavior, emotional intelligence, and nonverbal influence. By the end of this talk, you will understand the precise neurological reason why the more you heal, the less you tolerate. How your own nonverbal behavior is broadcasting your boundaries to everyone in the room, and how to permanently rewrite your internal standard for what you allow into your life. Stay right where you are. Do not close this video, because what you are about to learn in the next few minutes will completely change how you read every room you walk into for the rest of your life. Let's perform a brief experiment. Think of the person in your life who drains you the most, the one who demands your time, subtly undermines your confidence, or leaves you feeling exhausted after every interaction. Now ask yourself, why are they still there? They aren't in your life by accident. They are in your life because your emotional baseline permitted them entry. When we talk about Daniel Goleman's groundbreaking work on emotional intelligence, most people focus on empathy, social skills, and self-awareness. But there is a secondary effect of high emotional intelligence that rarely gets discussed in polite conversation. As your self-awareness increases, your tolerance for bullshit drops to zero. If you are currently tolerating toxic behavior in your relationships, your workplace, or your family, it is not because you are a kind person. It is because you have an unhealed emotional wound that is misrepresenting boundary enforcement as a threat to your safety. By the time we finish today, you will understand the mechanics of this psychological trap, and more importantly, how to break it permanently. Let's look at what happens inside the brain. When a person experiences chronic stress, childhood invalidation, or emotional trauma, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, becomes hyperreactive. In this state, your brain prioritizes survival over high-level decision-making. When someone treats you poorly, a healthy, regulated nervous system registers a spike in discomfort and prompts an immediate behavioral response. This violates my boundary. I am leaving or putting a stop to this. But in an unhealed nervous system, the brain performs a dark piece of psychological math. Conflict equals danger. To avoid conflict, the brain overrides your self-respect. You make excuses for the person. You rationalize their disrespect. You tell yourself, they had a hard day, or I'm probably overreacting. This is not empathy. This is an amygdala hijack designed to keep you agreeable, so you don't face the perceived threat of rejection or confrontation. Unhealed people tolerate mistreatment because disrespect feels normal to them. It matches their internal environment. Human beings are constantly broadcasting their internal state through nonverbal cues. Manipulators, consciously or subconsciously, are apex predators of body language. They look for specific behavioral indicators that signal low boundaries. Over-nodding. Nodding rapidly while someone else is speaking to signal submission and eagerness to please. Elevated pitch at sentence endings. Turning statements into questions to seek covert permission. Postural collapse. Ouching the shoulders inward to make the body appear smaller and less threatening. Nervous laughter. Laughing right after making a valid point or receiving a slight, attempting to soften the energy in the room. When you haven't healed your core self-worth, you broadcast these signals constantly. You are essentially wearing a sign that says, "You can push me and I won't push back." Healing is often sold as soft self-care, bubble baths, journal entries, and positive affirmations. In behavioral science, healing looks very different. Healing is the systematic recalibration of your nervous system. It is the process of moving from a state of emotional reactivity to a state of emotional self-regulation. When you develop true self-awareness, the cornerstone of Goleman's model, you begin to observe your emotions as neutral data rather than commands. When someone attempts to manipulate or disrespect you, a healed person does not explode with rage. Rage is just another form of dynamic weakness. It shows the other person still controls your emotional state. Instead, a healed person displays calm indifference. When you reach this level of emotional maturity, your life begins to purge itself automatically. You stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You realize that trying to convince a manipulator to see your perspective is like trying to explain color to someone who profits from being blind. You lose interest in one-sided dynamics. If the effort isn't mirrored, the connection dies on the vine. You don't make a dramatic scene. You simply withdraw your investment. Your circle shrinks, but its quality skyrockets. You no longer measure relationships by length of time, but by depth of safety, respect, and mutual value. The equation is simple. Self-awareness plus self-regulation equals unshakable boundaries. Look at the behavior, register it for what it is, and execute a cold, clean boundary. The ultimate test of your emotional healing isn't how peaceful you feel when you're alone in a quiet room. It's who you allow to sit at your table when you step out into the world. If you want to know how much you've healed over the past year, don't look at how many self-help books you've read. Look at what you tolerate today that would have broken you 2 years ago. Look at how quickly you walk away from situations that compromise your peace. The next time someone tests your limits, remember this. Every boundary you enforce is a vote of confidence in your future self. Stop letting people borrow your power. Heal the baseline, raise your standard, and watch how quickly your environment transforms around you. Think about the baseline of an old analog television. When you turn it on and there is no signal, you get static. It is loud, harsh, and abrasive. But if that static plays in your living room for 6 months straight, a fascinating neurological adaptation occurs. Your brain stops registering the noise as an anomaly. It begins to treat the static as the background ambience of your reality. It turns down the volume internally, normalizes the friction, and adjusts your sensory baseline. This exact mechanism occurs within human psychology when you carry unhealed emotional trauma. When you grow up or exist in an environment defined by high stress, emotional unpredictability, covert control, or outright disrespect, your nervous system is forced to adapt to survive. It cannot remain in a perpetual state of red alert alarm, so it performs a dangerous recalibration. It takes behavior that should trigger an immediate fight or flight response, passive aggression, boundary violations, gaslighting, emotional neglect, and codes it as normal operational baseline. Because this distorted baseline becomes your internal standard, your boundary threshold shifts dramatically downward. What an emotionally regulated, healthy individual would register as an immediate red flag within 5 seconds of an interaction, an unhealed individual registers as minor, acceptable background noise. You convince yourself that you are just being patient, understanding, or forgiving. You tell yourself, that's just how they are, or it wasn't that big of a deal. But if you run a behavioral analysis on what is actually happening beneath the surface, it isn't patience at all. It is a neurological tolerance built on a corrupted baseline. This shift in baseline alters the way you process human interaction on a subconscious level. When someone crosses a boundary, your brain looks at its internal reference library to decide how to react. If your reference library is filled with historical instances of your boundaries being ignored, your brain assumes that boundary erosion is simply the price of admission for human connection. It tells you that speaking up will lead to abandonment, conflict, or danger. So instead of erecting a firm wall, you absorb the impact. You swallow the discomfort. You adapt to the mistreatment, just like your brain adapted to the static on the television. The insidious nature of this baseline shift is that it creates an invisible magnetic draw toward people who perpetuate the dynamic. Manipulative personalities, narcissists, and toxic individuals possess an almost subconscious radar for people with lowered baselines. They don't need to perform a psychological assessment. They simply test a micro-boundary. They drop a subtle, backhanded compliment, show up 20 minutes late without an apology, or interrupt you mid-sentence. If your baseline is corrupted, you won't call it out. You'll laugh it off, excuse it, or smooth it over. To a manipulator, that subtle, non-verbal compliance is a green light. You have just signaled that your baseline permits boundary erosion, and they will proceed to take as much territory as you allow. To reverse this, you have to realize that your tolerance levels are not a measure of your goodness or your capacity to love. They are a direct reflection of your internal baseline. Until you heal the underlying belief that conflict is fatal and that your peace is negotiable, you will continue to mistake toxic endurance for emotional strength. Healing is the deliberate, systematic process of erasing that old reference library, raising the baseline, and forcing your nervous system to recognize that static is not, and never was, silence. To understand why an unhealed mind tolerates mistreatment, you have to look directly at the survival architecture of the human brain. Deep within the limbic system lies the amygdala, a primal structure responsible for detecting threats and triggering the physiological responses necessary to keep you alive. When your nervous system is balanced and regulated, the amygdala acts like a smart security system. It assesses incoming social and emotional data, differentiates between real danger and minor fiction, and passes control to the prefrontal cortex, the logical, analytical command center of the brain, so you can respond with clarity, strategy, and firm boundaries. However, when you carry unhealed trauma or chronic emotional invalidation, that security system suffers a critical failure. It becomes hypervigilant, perpetually locked in a state of high alert. In neuroscience, this phenomenon is known as an amygdala hijack. When an amygdala hijack occurs, the brain's survival circuitry completely bypasses the logical prefrontal cortex. The brain no longer evaluates whether a situation is fair, respectful, or healthy. It evaluates the situation through a single primitive lens. How do I survive this moment with the least amount of immediate damage? When an unhealed person encounters a boundary violation, whether it is a boss making unreasonable demands, a partner making a sharp, dismissive comment, or a friend taking advantage of their generosity, the hypervigilant amygdala registers the potential conflict as a critical threat to survival. To the primitive brain, social rejection, confrontation, or abandonment feels indistinguishable from physical danger. Because the logical part of your brain has been taken offline by this neurochemical flood of cortisol and adrenaline, your instinctual behavior takes over. Instead of executing the fight response by standing up for yourself, or the flight response by walking away, the nervous system defaults to a lesser-known survival strategy, the fawn response. Fawning is the immediate automatic impulse to appease, soothe, and placate the perceived aggressor to neutralize the threat. When you are trapped in this state, your brain prioritizes appeasement over self-worth every single time. You find yourself nodding along with things you disagree with. You apologize for things that were not your fault. You flash a quick, nervous smile to diffuse tension in the room. You swallow your legitimate anger and replace it with extreme politeness. From a behavioral perspective, you are playing dead socially to avoid being attacked. You convince yourself that you are just keeping the peace, but neurologically, you are in a state of hostage negotiation with your own environment. The tragic irony of the amygdala hijack is that it completely distorts your perception of power. A person who is hypervigilant believes that by appeasing the controller, the bully, or the narcissist, they are maintaining safety. In reality, they are handing over absolute authority. Toxic personalities have an extraordinary radar for this hypervigilant state. They can sense when your nervous system has panicked, and they will use that freeze and appease window to push your boundaries even further. Until you actively regulate your nervous system and dismantle this automatic threat response, your brain will continue to sacrifice your dignity on the altar of immediate safety. You cannot think your way into higher self-respect while your brain is convinced that setting a boundary will result in destruction. Healing requires you to train the amygdala to recognize that adult conflict is not a lethal threat, that disapproval is not abandonment, and that standing your ground is far safer than living on your knees. When people talk about healing, they often frame it as a gentle, passive state of self-care, something soft, quiet, and purely emotional. But if you analyze human behavior through a cold, operational lens, true emotional healing is not a passive luxury. It is a violent, structural disruption of your internal value system. It is a fundamental neurological shift that completely rewrites how much disrespect, energy drain, or manipulation your brain will process before triggering an immediate, non-negotiable boundary response. To understand how this recalibration works, you have to look at how the brain assigns value. Every second of the day, your brain is performing a subconscious cost-benefit analysis on the energy you expend versus the return you receive. When you operate from an unhealed state, your perceived self-value is artificially low. Because you do not hold your own time, attention, and peace in high regard, your brain treats your personal resources as cheap currency. You will spend hours overanalyzing a toxic text message. You will waste years trying to fix a broken dynamic. You will let people drain your cognitive bandwidth because, on a deep neurological level, your brain doesn't view your bandwidth as something valuable that requires protection. Healing is the systematic destruction of that low-value baseline. It is the process of training your brain to recognize that your emotional, mental, and physical energy is a finite, high-value asset. When you begin to genuinely heal through deep self-awareness, nervous system regulation, and cognitive reframing, your internal valuation model flips. You stop viewing your boundaries as a selfish luxury and start viewing them as an operational necessity. This internal recalibration changes your cognitive processing speed. When an unhealed person encounters a disrespect signal, a backhanded compliment, a broken promise, a passive-aggressive swipe, their brain enters a slow, painful cycle of doubt. They ask, did they mean it that way? Am I being too sensitive? How can I fix this? They spend massive amounts of energy attempting to rationalize the friction. But when a healed person whose value model has been recalibrated encounters that exact same disrespect signal, the brain processes it instantly. There is no endless inner debate. The brain registers the input as an immediate system violation, and the emotional gate closes in seconds. This is why healing looks cold or aggressive to people who are used to taking advantage of you. They are accustomed to you spending your energy to accommodate them. When your internal value recalibrates, you stop offering discounts on your self-respect. You no longer allow people to negotiate with your standards. The moment someone demonstrates that they cannot meet your baseline of basic respect and reciprocity, your brain no longer attempts to change them, argue with them, or convince them. It simply revokes their access to your life. This recalibration is the ultimate form of behavioral self-defense. It transforms boundaries from something you have to force yourself to remember into an automatic, reflex-level response. You do not need to practice being firm. Firmness becomes the natural byproduct of knowing your exact worth. When your internal valuation is locked at the highest setting, the cost of allowing toxic, manipulative, or draining energy into your field becomes impossibly high, and your brain refuses to pay it. Every single thought, belief, and level of self-worth you carry inside your mind is constantly leaking out into the physical world through your body language. You might believe you are hiding your insecurities or presenting a confident facade, but behavioral science tells us that the human body is a broadcast system that leaks nonverbal data every fraction of a second. When you lack emotional regulation and carry unhealed wounds, you don't just feel low self-value on the inside. You subconsciously telegraph it through a distinct cluster of nonverbal micro-behaviors that act as a silent beacon for manipulative dynamics. Consider the physical mechanics of a person with an unhealed baseline. Watch their face during a conversation. When confronted with slight social pressure or a backhanded compliment, they perform a nervous micro-laugh, a subtle, high-pitched chuckle designed to soften the room and signal, I am harmless, please don't target me. Look at their head movements. They engage in rapid, excessive nodding while someone else is speaking, a placating gesture known as social fawning. Watch their posture. They subconsciously collapse their chest inward, pull their chin down, and minimize their physical footprint, attempting to make themselves appear smaller and less threatening to avoid attracting conflict. Even their eye behavior betrays them. Rapid blink rates, frequent downward gaze shifts, and an inability to hold comfortable, steady eye contact during a moment of tension. These micro-expressions of tolerance are not random habits. They are submissive baseline indicators. To the average person, these behaviors might just make you look a little shy or overly polite. But to individuals who operate with high degrees of covert manipulation, narcissism, or toxic control, these microexpressions are the ultimate diagnostic tool. Predators of human weakness do not select their targets by asking questions. They select them by reading the room. They drop a tiny boundary test, an interruption, a sarcastic dig, a minor intrusion on your space, and they watch your body's nonverbal leakage. If your response to that test is a nervous smile, an apology, a head tilt, or a sudden burst of over-explaining, you have just failed the diagnostic. You have non-verbally communicated, "My threshold for disrespect is high, and my ability to enforce a boundary is low." The tragedy of these physical leaks is that they create a self-fulfilling loop. Because your body language signals low boundaries, you continuously attract people who take advantage of those low boundaries, which reinforces your internal trauma, which in turn causes your body to leak even more submissive signals. You become trapped in an environment of high tolerance because your body is actively inviting the very behavior your mind claims to hate. Healing reverses this leak from the inside out. When you systematically regulate your nervous system and reclaim your value, your physical baseline shifts automatically. You don't have to fake confidence or memorize a list of power poses. Your blink rate slows down. Your posture opens up naturally without force because your body no longer feels the need to shield its vitals from a perceived threat. You look people directly in the eyes, not with aggression, but with a still, calm neutrality. When someone crosses a line, the nervous laughter disappears entirely. It is replaced by physical stillness, a complete lack of placating movement that signals to the entire room that your boundaries are non-negotiable. If you ask the average person to measure their emotional growth, they will point to how happy they feel, how peaceful their days are, or how many self-help concepts they have committed to memory. But emotional progress cannot be measured by positive emotions because positive emotions are easy to feel when you are isolated in a controlled, stress-free environment. In the real world, the ultimate definitive metric of your recovery is not your emotional peak. It is your speed of disengagement. It is how many seconds or minutes it takes for you to completely withdraw your energy from situations, people, and environments that violate your fundamental self-respect. When you are unhealed, your disengagement speed is painfully slow. You process disrespect through a long, exhausting cycle of emotional bargaining. Someone crosses a boundary, and instead of leaving, you engage. You over-explain your feelings, hoping that if you just find the perfect combination of words, they will finally understand the damage they are causing. You engage in explosive arguments, trying to force a toxic person to admit their wrongdoings, failing to realize that your anger is still giving them the exact reaction and access they desire. Or worse, you remain frozen in silence for months or years, slowly letting your self-worth erode while waiting for the situation to fix itself. In all of these scenarios, your slow disengagement proves that your unhealed nervous system still believes you have something to gain from staying in the fight. True healing completely eliminates this delay. As your self-awareness and internal baseline shift, disengagement stops being a dramatic, loud event and transforms into a swift, silent, operational habit. The moment an environment or individual demonstrates a fundamental lack of respect, your brain no longer registers a debate. It registers a conclusion. You no longer waste breath trying to convince someone to value you. You stop arguing with individuals who profit from misunderstanding you. You don't write long paragraphs of text explaining why you are hurt, nor do you demand grand apologies to validate your pain. Instead, your reaction speed accelerates to the point of near instantaneous detachment. You offer a calm, neutral response, set a clean boundary, or simply turn around and walk away.